Hello, Year 4s. Now, if you remember, we left the story yesterday with the old woman and the boy sitting in the kitchen, and she was about to tell him about Bertie. So let's see in chapter 3 who Bertie was. Timbavati. Bertie was born in South Africa in a remote farmhouse near a place called Timbavati. It was shortly after Bertie first started to walk that his mother and father decided a fence must be put around the farmhouse to make a compound where Bertie could play in safety. It wouldn't keep the snakes out, nothing would do that, but at least Bertie would be safe now from the leopards and the lions and the spotted hyenas. Enclosed within the compound were the lawns and gardens at the front of the house, and the stables and barns at the back, all the room a child would need or want, you might think, but not Bertie. The farm stretched as far as the eye could see in all directions, 20,000 acres of veldt. Bertie's father farmed cattle. The times were hard. The rains had failed too often, and many of the rivers and the water holes had all but dried up. With fewer wildebeest and impala to prey on, the lions and leopards would sneak up on the cattle whenever they could. So Bertie's father was more often than not away from home with his men, guarding the cattle. Every time he left, he'd say the same thing. "Don't you ever open that gate, Bertie, you hear me? There's lions out there, leopards, elephants, hyenas. You stay put, you hear?" Bertie would stand at the fence and watch him ride out, and he would be left behind with his mother, who was also his teacher. There were no schools for 100 miles, and his mother, too, was always warning him to stay inside the fence. "Look what happened in Peter and the Wolf," she would say. His mother was often sick with malaria, and even when she wasn't sick, she'd be listless and sad. There were good days when she would play the piano for him and play hide and seek around the compound, or he'd sit on her lap and on the sofa and look out on the veranda, and she'd just talk and talk all about her home in England, about how much she hated the wildness and the loneliness of Africa, and about how Bertie was everything to her. But they were rare days. Every morning he'd climb into her bed and snuggle up to her, hoping against hope that today should be well and happy. But so often she wasn't, and Bertie would be left on his own again, to his own devices. There was a waterhole downhill from the farmhouse, and some distance away. That waterhole, when there was water in it, became Bertie's whole world. He would spend hours in the dusty compound, his hands gripping the fence, looking out at the wonders of the veldt, at the giraffes drinking spread-legged at the waterhole, at the browsing impala, tails twitching alert, at the warthog snorting and snuffling under the shade of the shingai tree, at the baboons, the zebras, the wildebeest, and the elephants bathing in the mud. But the moment that Bertie always longed for was when a pride of lions came padding out of the veldt. The impala were the first to spring away, then the zebra would panic and gallop off. Within seconds the lions would have the waterhole to themselves, and they would crouch to drink. From the safe haven of the compound, Bertie looked and learned as he grew up. By now he could climb the tree by the farmhouse and sit high in its branches. He could see better from up there. He would wait for his lions for hours on end. He got to know the life of the waterhole so well that he could feel the lions were out there even before he could see them. Bertie had no friends to play with, but he always said that he was never lonely as a child. At night he loved reading his books and losing himself in the stories, and by day his heart was out in the veldt with the animals. That was where he yearned to be. Whenever his mother was well enough, he would beg her to take him outside the compound, but her answer was always the same. "I can't, Bertie. Your father has forbidden it," she'd say. And that was that. The men would come home with their stories of the veldt, of the family of cheetahs sitting like sentinels on their kopje, of the leopard that they had spotted high in his tree larder, watching over his kill, of the hyenas that they had driven off, of the herd of elephants which had stampeded the cattle. And Bertie would listen, wide-eyed, agog. Again and again he asked his father if he could go with him to guard the cattle. His father just laughed, patted his head, and said it was man's work. He did teach Bertie how to ride and how to shoot too, but always within the confines of the compound. Week in, week out, Bertie had to stay behind the fence. He made up his mind, though, that if no one would take him out into the veldt, then one day he would go by himself. But something always held him back. Perhaps it was one of those tales he'd been told of the black mamba snakes whose bite would kill you within 10 minutes, of hyenas whose jaws would crunch you to bits, of vultures who would finish off anything that was left so that no one could find even the bits. For the time being he stayed behind the fence, but the more he grew up, the more his compound became a prison to him. One evening, Bertie must have been about 6 years old by now, he was sitting high up in the branches of his tree, hoping against hope the lions might come down for their sunset drink, as they often did. He was thinking of giving up, for it would soon be too dark to see much now, when he saw a solitary lioness come down to the waterhole. Then he saw that she was not alone. Behind her, and on unsteady legs, came what looked like a lion cub, but it was white, glowing white in the gathering gloom of dusk. While the lioness drank, the cub played at catching her tail, and then, when she had her fill, the two of them slipped away into the long grass and were gone. Bertie ran inside, screaming with excitement. He had to tell someone, anyone. He found his father working at his desk. "Impossible," said his father. "You're seeing things that aren't there, or you're telling fibs, one of the two." "I saw him, I promise," Bertie insisted. But his father would have none of it, and sent him to his room for arguing. His mother came to see him later. "Anyone can make a mistake, Bertie, dear," she said. "It must have been the sunset. It plays tricks with your eyes sometimes. There's no such thing as a white lion." The next evening Bertie watched again at the fence, but the white lion cub and the lioness did not come, nor did they the next evening, nor the next. Bertie began to think he must have been dreaming it. A week or more passed, and there had been only a few zebras and wildebeest down at the waterhole. Bertie was already upstairs in his room when he heard his father riding into the compound, and then the stamp of his heavy boots on the veranda. "We got her, he was saying. "Huge lioness, massive she was. She had taken 6 of my best cattle in the last 2 weeks. Well, she won't be taking any more." Bertie's heart stopped. In that one terrible moment, he knew which lioness his father was talking about. There could be no doubt about it. His white lion cub had been orphaned. "But what if," Bertie's mother was saying, "what if she had young ones to feed? Perhaps they were starving." So will we be if we let it go on. We had to shoot her," his father retorted. Bertie lay there all night, listening to the plaintive roaring echoing through the veldt, as if every lion in Africa was sounding a lament. He turned his face into his pillow and could think of nothing but the orphaned white cub, and he promised himself there and then that if ever the cub came down to the waterhole looking for his dead mother, then he would do what he had never dared to do. He would open the gate and go out and bring him home. He would not let him die out there all alone. But no lion cub came to the waterhole. All day, every day, he waited for him to come, but he never came. So let's see in chapter 4 if he comes. Chapter 4, Bertie and the Lion. One morning, a week or so later, Bertie was woken by a chorus of urgent neighing. He jumped out of his bed and ran to the window. A herd of zebras was scattering away from the waterhole, chased by a couple of hyenas. Then he saw more hyenas, 3 of them standing stock still, noses pointing, eyes fixed on the waterhole. It was only now that Bertie saw the lion cub, but this one wasn't white at all. He was covered in mud, with his back to the waterhole, and he was waving a pathetic paw at the hyenas who were beginning to circle. The lion cub had nowhere to run to, and the hyenas were sidling ever closer. Bertie was downstairs in a flash, leaping off the veranda and racing barefoot across the compound, shouting at the top of his voice. He threw open the gate and charged down the hill towards the waterhole, yelling and screaming and waving his arms like a wild thing. Startled at the sudden intrusion, The hyenas turned tail and ran, but not far. Once within range, Bertie hurled a broadside of pebbles at them, and they ran off again, but again not far. Then he was at the waterhole and between the lion cub and the hyenas, shouting at them to go away. They didn't. They stood and watched, uncertain for a while. Then they began to circle again, closer and closer. That was when the shot rang out. The hyenas bolted into the long grass and were gone. When Bertie turned round, he saw his mother in her nightgown, rifle in hand, running towards him down the hill. He had never seen her run before. Between them they gathered up the mud-matted cub and brought him home. He was too weak to struggle, though he tried. As soon as they had given him some warm milk, they dunked him in the bath to wash him. As the first of the mud came off, Bertie saw that he was white underneath. "You see," he cried triumphantly, "he is white, he is. I told you, didn't I? He's my white lion." His mother still could not bring herself to believe it. 5 baths later, she had to. They sat him down by the stove in a washing basket and fed him again all the milk he could drink, and he drank the lot. Then he lay down and slept. He was still asleep when Bertie's father came back at lunchtime. They told him what had happened. "Please, father, I want to keep him," Bertie said. "And so do I," said his mother. "We both do." And she spoke as Bertie had never heard her speak before, her voice strong, determined. Bertie's father didn't seem to know quite how to reply. He just said, "We'll talk about it later," and then he walked out. They did talk about it later when Bertie was supposed to be in bed. He wasn't, though. He heard them arguing. He was outside the sitting room door, watching, listening. His father was pacing up and down. "He'll grow up, you know," he was saying. "You can't keep a grown lion, you know that." "And you know that we can't just throw him to the hyenas," replied his mother. "He needs us. Maybe we need him. He'll be someone for Bertie to play with for a while." And then she added sadly, "After all, it's not as if he's going to have any brothers or sisters, is it?" At this, Bertie's father went over to her and kissed her gently on the forehead. It was the only time Bertie had ever seen him kiss her. "All right then," he said. "All right, you can keep your lion." So the white lion cub came to live amongst them in the farmhouse. He slept at the end of Bertie's bed. Wherever Bertie went, the lion cub went too, even to the bathroom, where he would watch Bertie have his bath and lick his legs dry afterwards. They were never apart. It was Bertie who saw to the feeding, milk 4 times a day from one of his father's beer bottles, until later on when the lion cub lapped from a soup bowl. There was impala meat whenever he wanted it, and as he grew, and he grew fast, he wanted more and more of it. For the first time in his life, Bertie was totally happy. The lion cub was all the brother and sisters that he could ever want, all the friends he could ever need. The 2 of them would sit by the side of the sofa, out on the veranda, and watch the great red sun go down over Africa. And Bertie would read him Peter and the Wolf. And at the end he would always promise him that he would never let him go off to a zoo and live behind bars like the wolf in the story. And the lion cub would look up at Bertie with his trusting amber eyes. "Why don't you give him a name?" his mother once asked him. "Because he doesn't need one," replied Bertie. "He's a lion, not a person. Lions don't need names." Bertie's mother was always wonderfully patient with the lion, no matter how much mess he made, how many cushions he pounced on and ripped apart, no matter how much crockery he smashed. None of it seemed to upset her. And strangely, she was hardly ever ill these days. There was a spring to her step, and her laughter pealed around the house. His father was less happy about it. "Lions," he'd mutter on, "should not live in houses. You should keep him outside in the compound." But they never did. For both mother and son, the lion had brought new life to their days, life and laughter. The end. I'll see you tomorrow.